Welcome back to the TM podcast. Today I'll talk to you about the Butcher of Rostov. This is a case out of the former Soviet Union. His real name was Andrei Chikatilo. I apologize in advance for any mispronounced words. A lot of this is in Russian, and I know absolutely nothing about the Russian language. And before I get started, I would like to take a second to recognize the sponsors of this podcast. First, being huntakiller.com. Do you love watching detective shows or movies, but wish there was a way that you could join in on the investigation? Well, with Hunt a Killer, you can. Join the thousands of other people in the Hunt a Killer community and help solve cases just like the ones that you see on TV. For more information, please follow the links in my post, and remember that you can get 20% off your first box using the promo code TMPodcast. The next sponsor, as you've probably seen in my recent posts, is Gabriel & Co. Gabriel & Co. is the #1 retail jewelry store in the United States. Find anything from bracelets and earrings to engagement or wedding rings. Now, I know high-end jewelry isn't something that most of you probably buy on a regular basis, but follow my links when you do and tell them that the TM podcast sent you. Now, my last but not least is my newest sponsor, MyMedic.com. MyMedic makes the best first aid kits on the planet. They're the one-stop destination for all of your medical gear needs. Their kits are designed for everyone, your home, car, work, or just a specific activity. They've got you covered. Their supplies have been tested by experts, and their goal is to keep you prepared while you're out doing what you love. I'll add all of these website links to my post, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. Now, back to the Butcher of Rostov. Andrei Chikatilo was born on October 16, 1936, in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. He was born into a terrible time. His parents lived in a very small, one-room hut, and the entire area was going through a famine thanks to Joseph Stalin. His parents worked on a farm, but they didn't even get paid for it. They worked in exchange for the right to live and cultivate the land. Famine was so bad during this time that his parents had to eat grass and leaves sometimes just to keep from starving, and there was even rumored cannibalism in the same area. This was a time of war and chaos. His father was forced to go to war when he was very young, and Andrei and his mother had to survive on their own. As a young child, he saw shootings, bombings, and even the burning of his own home at one point. During this time, he had to sleep in the same bed as his mother, and he was known to have been a chronic bedwetter. While his father was gone to war in 1943, his mother gave birth to a girl named Tatiana. Now, obviously, since the father was out to war, this wasn't his father's child. It was a very common thing during this time for German soldiers to rape Ukrainian women, so that's probably how the child came to be. This hasn't ever been proven, it's just speculation, but if it was the case, Andrei probably witnessed that event, which adds to the shit show that was his entire childhood. In 1944, he began school. He was a shy and small boy and was often bullied because of that. In spite of that, he did well in school and loved reading. By his teenage years, he had become a good student in the eyes of the teachers. He was even appointed the editor of the school newspaper, and he was also made to be the chairman of the People's Communist Party at 16 and became their task organizer for street marches, which is a wild title to hold at that age, and even wilder that it was backed by the school, but different time. He discovered that he had chronic impotence as a teen, and he was very shy around women. It was reported that around this time he wrestled a younger girl and accidentally ejaculated as she struggled to get away. Anyways, in 1954 he graduated with good grades despite the bullying, famine, and poverty. His grades were good enough to graduate, but not good enough to get him into college, so he moved to the city of Kursk and became a general laborer for a few months. He believed that he didn't get into college because his father was deemed a traitor because he had been captured in the war. He decided to enroll into a vocational school to try to become a communications technician. During this time, he met a girl and they started dating. They tried several times to have sex, but he couldn't keep it up due to his impotence. This caused the girl to break off the relationship and move on. He was obviously angered and sad, but there was nothing that he could do about it. After he completed his vocational school, he moved to the Urals city and started working a construction job. He started taking courses in engineering during this time as well, and he worked in the same place for around 2 years. But he got drafted into the Soviet Army in 1957. He served from 1957 through 1960. Right before he got out of the military, he joined the Communist Party. And when his service was over, he headed back to live with his parents in the village that he was born in. Seems like an odd situation to return to, as the whole mom having a baby while the dad was gone situation, but I guess that's none of our business. He met a girl that he really liked and they began dating. But just like last time, their attempts at intimacy failed. The girl asked for advice from friends on how to fix the problem, but instead of helping, all it did was let everyone in the village know that he was impotent. He was embarrassed and ashamed, and he claims that he tried to commit suicide as a result, but his mother pulled him out of the noose. He decided that he would flee his native village to get away from all of the embarrassment. He moved to a town called Rostov-on-Don and found a job as a communications engineer. In 1961, he relocated to an area of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, or more easily said as SFSR. His younger sister had finished school by this time and decided that she would move in with him. She quickly met a man that she married and moved out in less than 6 months. She said that nothing strange happened during her time there and even wanted to try and help find her brother someone to love so that he could start a family for himself. Well, she succeeded in lining him up with a woman named Feodosia Odnachiva. They were basically an arranged marriage that was set up by his sister, but the woman was already aware of his impotence problems. During this time, he enrolled as a correspondence student at Rostov University, studying literature and philology. Philology is the study of literary texts and written records. I was kind of hoping that there was an entire course in college devoted to the study of a man named Phil, but for me and all the Phils out there, it is not. Anyways, Andrei said that him and his new wife didn't have sex often, but they came to an agreement on how they would conceive a child. Since he would lose his erection inside of her, they decided that she would get him off and then just shove the semen in there with her fingers. I feel like maybe there's a less weird way to do or even say that, but to each their own. Believe it or not, that actually worked, and they had a daughter in 1965 that they named Lyudmila, and a son named Yuri in 1969. I apologize again for murdering the pronunciations of pretty much all of these names. I'm from the southern United States, and I would be lying if I said I knew even the tiniest bit of Russian. So in 1970, he graduates with his degree in literature and philology and started a new career as a teacher. He wasn't the best teacher though. He knew what he was talking about, but he could not control his classes. We've all had at least one teacher in school that was this way. Usually it was a younger substitute teacher that had the best intentions, but for some reason just couldn't keep everything under control. Now this is the point in which things start to head south for Andrei. In May of 1973, he assaulted a 15-year-old student of his by touching her breasts and genitals and actually ejaculating in the process as she struggled to get away. A few months later, he locked another teenage girl in his classroom and assaulted her in the exact same way. For whatever reason, he was not held accountable initially for these incidents, but complaints started to roll in from students and even other teachers of his odd behavior. Some teachers said they would catch him fondling himself in the presence of his own students. One of his jobs was to make sure that students were in their dorms at night, as this was a boarding school and students had been complaining that he would run into the girls' dorms at night, hoping to see them naked. The director of the school found out about the complaints and gave Andrei the option to either resign or be fired, and he obviously resigned. I don't think that's a fair option at all, even by the standards of the 70s. How many times has this same situation happened where a teacher or coach skates by because of this and ends up assaulting more people because they were never actually held accountable? The very first offense of assaulting a child as a teacher should warrant jail time and bar you from ever being a teacher or even around children in general. So since there were no real repercussions for his action, he moved on to be a teacher at another school in 1974. He was a teacher there until 1978 when there was staffing cutbacks and he was let go. I'm sure that he got away with more things there, but they just didn't find out about him. So again, he finds a new teaching job somewhere else. At the same time, Andrei had secretly purchased a new home. I'm not sure how you do that, but he did. And on December 22nd, 1978, he lured a 9-year-old girl named Yelena where he attempted to rape her. He couldn't maintain an erection though, and in his frustration, he choked and stabbed her to death. He said that he had ejaculated while stabbing her. He then threw her body into the Grushevka River and went back home. 2 days later, police found her body along with her backpack. And even though there was blood near Andrei's secret home and neighbors described a man that was similar to him, a different man named Alexander was arrested for the crime. Apparently he had been arrested before for a similar offense. He actually said that he did it initially, but later retracted his statement, but it was too late. He was executed by firing squad for the murder, and the authorities had no idea that they had the wrong man. In March of 1981, several allegations of sexual assault and molestation surfaced, and Andrei was fired and barred from teaching finally. See what I mean? Any assault after 1973 could have been prevented had the first school done their job and not protected him. He ended up getting a new job as a supply clerk for a factory that produced construction materials. This job required a lot of travel. Since the killing of Yelena, he had been fantasizing about the feeling that he got from stabbing her. He said that it was physically hard for him to resist that urge, but he did that for a few years. On September 3rd, 1981, he saw a 17-year-old girl named Larissa at a bus stop, and he finally caved into his urges. He lured her into the forest by saying that he would sit by the Don River and drink vodka and relax with her. When they got down deep enough into the woods, he pushed her down and tried to rape her. He shoved mud into her mouth to keep her quiet, and then when he could not maintain an erection, he punched and strangled her to death. Without a knife, he used sticks to cut her up and bit her all over her body and even ripped her nipple off with his teeth. He then covered her body with sticks and leaves. Her body was discovered the next day. 9 months later, he lured a 13-year-old girl into the woods and stabbed her 22 times. He had reached a point that his urges were in control and there was no turning back. From July to September in 1982, he would go on to kill 5 more people that same way. Their ages ranged from 9 to 18. Investigators started to see a pattern in some victims with an unusual amount of stab wounds as well as attempts at gouging the eyes out of the victims. Andrei says that he only went into a blind murderous rage when he couldn't keep it up and could only get off by stabbing someone. In December of 1982, he lured a 10-year-old girl off of a bus and stabbed her over 50 times. Then he ripped her chest open, cut out her bowels and uterus, and discarded them. Investigators at this point had only linked 4 of these victims to the same killer, and they were working diligently to make sure the killing stopped, unaware that the same person was responsible for more than just what they thought. Andrei took a few months off of killing, and I assume it was because the police were in full force trying to figure this out, but continued again in June of 1983. He murdered a 15-year-old Armenian girl in the same fashion as the others. He then killed 5 more victims after her in the same exact way from June to September. The police had begun linking all of these together and were very aware that a serial killer was on the loose. They feared that due to the nature of the murders, they were either done by someone trying to harvest the organs or a satanic cult. They started investigating all known pedophiles in hopes of finding the killer, but they had no luck. They investigated so many people during this time that they solved over 1,000 other unrelated crimes to include 95 murders, 245 rapes, and 140 assaults. Some people that weren't guilty confessed, causing unnecessary confusion, but for some reason that always happens. Even though people were confessing and being arrested, bodies were still being found. Some victims had an upwards of 70 stab wounds, and it was obvious that the situation was escalating. In March of 1984, Andrei lured a 10-year-old boy away from a stamp kiosk and murdered him. Several witnesses actually saw him leave with the boy and were able to give a very detailed description, and when police found the boy's body, they were able to collect semen samples and even found a footprint. Several murders later, police still could not track the person responsible. They had the DNA, but no way of linking it to Andrei as he had no prior crimes. In the summer of 1984, he was fired from his supply job for theft of property, but he almost immediately found another job similar to that one. The day after he started his new job, he was already killing again. He would kill 5 additional people that month. On September 13, 1984, Andrei was seen trying to talk to young women at a bus station by an undercover cop. The police officer followed him and arrested him after he was witnessed attempting to rub against people in crowded areas. They discovered that on his person he had a large knife, rope, and Vaseline. They took blood samples from him, and it wasn't a match for some of the DNA that was found at the other murder scenes, because he was type A and the samples from the other scenes was type AB. Since they had him arrested though, they formally charged him with the theft of property from his former employer and put him in jail for a year. He got out on good behavior after 3 months and was back on his way. During his time in jail, investigators had formally linked 23 of the murders to the same person, but were still unable to link them to a single person. He would kill 3 more people almost immediately after release. The police reached out to a psychiatrist to help them build a psychological profile of the killer in the hopes that it would narrow down their search. The profile developed by the psychiatrist implied that the killer would be a male between 45 and 50 years old who had a terrible childhood and who was incapable of real courtship with females. He would probably be of average intelligence and was married but suffered from impotence, and murder was his only way of getting off, saying, quote, "His knife became a substitute for his penis, which failed him normally." The number of bodies being found started to slow, and the investigators started to think that the killer had moved away. When they found a body that was buried that matched the MO of the others, they feared that he had begun to hide the bodies better. In reality, Andrei had been watching the investigation very closely and only committing murders while out on business trips. It seemed that he had dialed back his urges, but he definitely did not stop. Over the next few years, he slowly began to murder more frequently, and police had to kick their investigation back up again. This time, they had plainclothes officers film passengers in train stations near where the bodies had been found, hoping to catch a glimpse of something. During this time, he killed over 10 more people. Into the early 90s, he was still killing without any repercussion or signs of slowing down, and the police were still no closer in figuring it out. They added a ton of uniformed police officers to train stations, and the officers were instructed to question any male with children that they came into contact with and document their name and passport number. This still did not stop Andrei, who still killed during this time. On November 6, 1990, after killing a 22-year-old woman, Andrei was spotted by an undercover officer washing his face and hands off in a train station. The officer noted he had a wound on his hand as well as dirt all over his jacket. He asked him what he was doing and what his name was. Andrei told him he was just collecting wild mushrooms, which was apparently normal for that time of year. The officer filed a report on it at the end of the day, along with any other names that he had acquired. A week or so later, they discovered the body of the woman that he had murdered near that same train station. They compiled a list of names noted during the weeks prior and discovered Andrei's name. They also discovered that his job would have put him in the locations of several of the other murders over the years. They investigated his previous job as a teacher and discovered the allegations of assault and lewd behavior. On the 14th of November, they placed him under police surveillance. They observed him trying to talk to several women and children during this time and eventually arrested him as he was leaving a cafe. The police had a medical examiner look at the wound on his hand, and it was determined that it came from the bite of a human. They began intense questioning over the next few days in hopes that he would confess, as most of their evidence was circumstantial. They tested his blood again, and it was still type A. They were really confused until they realized that the initial sample was actually from semen and not blood, so they got a semen sample from him, and it came back positive for type AB. On the 29th of November, Andrei finally confessed and said that he was the man that they were looking for. He initially confessed to 34 murders and gave investigators very detailed descriptions of each one to include positions of their bodies and how many times that he stabbed them. When they asked him why he gouged their eyes out, he said that he had initially believed the old superstition that a killer's image was trapped in the eyes of a victim, but later realized that this wasn't true. He also admitted that he would chew the uterus and testicles of his victims after he removed them, but he would not eat them. He did admit to swallowing a few tongues and nipples that he had ripped from his victims with his teeth. He would then go on to confess to an additional 22 murders in the same fashion, to include some that the police were unaware of. He led them to all but 3 bodies that he confessed to. In his trial, they had to construct a special cage to ensure that no one attacked him. People yelled and threw things at him during the trial, and it seemed like they were going to have to kick some people out of the courtroom, but it eventually died down. People fainted and cried loudly or got sick during the reading of his crimes, which is understandable. Listening to the details of a murder, assault, and cannibalism are hard enough, much less when they're your family. He was charged with 53 counts of murder and also charged with 5 counts of assault for the crimes he committed as a teacher. He was sentenced to death for each of the counts of murder. The judge criticized the police and prosecution for mistakes made throughout the years, allowing him to remain free and terrorize all of these people. He filed an appeal in 1993, but it was immediately rejected, and another in the following year, but it was denied as well. In February of 1994, he was taken to a soundproof room in his prison and executed with a single shot behind the right ear. I personally think he was probably responsible for more than just the murders he was convicted for, but he just hid them better. Towards the end, he kind of shut down trying to plead insanity, so we won't ever really know. I do wonder how in the hell he maintained at work and his personal life while murdering all these people. Surely his wife had to see something wrong with the guy. How did he explain having to get new teaching jobs or his injuries? I still also think that the first school system should feel guilty for some of this. Had they held him accountable the way that they should have the first time, they could have prevented a lot of this. That may not have stopped him completely, but it would have at least got his DNA onto a database, as well as stopped him from being a teacher. But what do you think? Let me know by reaching out to me on any of the social media accounts for this podcast or emailing me directly at tmpodcast19@gmail.com. Don't forget to show some love to the sponsors of the show by following the links in my posts. Also, please like, subscribe, or follow the podcast on whatever you're listening on, and please tell your friends about it. Thank you for listening to the TM Podcast.